Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Please, before starting, make sure that your cameras and microphones are turned off, so to make this webinar more smooth. And apart from that, I am Patricia Cogo, the President of European Guanxi, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar, titled The Indo-Pacific Strategy, Adjusting the EU's Regional Role in the Context of China's Rise. And European Guanxi has the privilege today of hosting a webinar with Cristina de Esperanza Ricardo. Cristina is a research assistant at EsadeGeo. EsadeGeo is a think tank chaired by former HRVP Javier Solana. She's also an Asia-Pacific analyst at Orden Mundial and a young leader at the Pacific Forum. Previously, she completed 2 traineeships at the EU Institute for Security Studies within the Asia desk and at the EU delegation to Australia. Cristina also graduated in international relations from the Rey Juan Carlos University in Madrid and holds a master in strategic studies from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. If you have, after Cristina's presentation, we will have a brief Q&A session. So whenever you come up with a question, please send it to me directly in the chat. And let me know if you want me to ask that question for you or if you prefer to do it yourself. Apart from that, I would leave the floor to you, Cristina.
Thank you very much to European Guanxi for having me here, and to all of you for being here as well on this Saturday afternoon. I will share my screen. 1 second. Okay, perfect. So, well, I will be presenting about the EU's strategy towards the Indo-Pacific. As some of you may know, the Council released some guidelines a couple of months ago, but both the EU's vision as well as the document is still a work in progress. So basically, I will be presenting on what the Indo-Pacific is, why the EU decides to develop this strategy, and then I will give some background on previous EU policies towards Asia, which is not exactly the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is, of course, a broader area, but I will be focusing on Asia, given that I will be also talking about China's role in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Then I will move to talk a bit more about the document itself and about probably next step and challenges. So basically, the Indo-Pacific, it's in the EU's understanding an area that stretches from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Island states. This is not a universal understanding, but what is clear is that it's a very vast area, predominantly maritime, and also that it has a very key strategic connotation. Basically, it arises also from the necessity to consider both the Indian and the Pacific Oceans as an integrated whole, also from China's expanding power and emerging other emerging powers in the region, such as, for instance, India. And when considering it integrated, the Indo-Pacific is basically the global center of gravity. So we have the Indo-Pacific as having key demographic weight, with 60% of the global population being from the Indo-Pacific. Also economic weight, with 2/3 of global economic growth coming from the region as well, and it's a manufacturing and innovation hub. But the problem is that it also faces key challenges. Basically, it's suffering from intensifying geopolitical competition and lacks actually a security architecture to mitigate these tensions. And also, for instance, their challenges are climate change, with 50% of global emissions coming from the Indo-Pacific. And just to give a little bit more of background on the Indo-Pacific, the authorship of the concept was attributed to Shinzo Abe, when in 2007, he made a speech during a visit to India and spoke of the Pacific and the Indian Oceans as being together in an integrated whole. And he also talked about this broader Asia as being transparent. He spoke of responsibility, and basically he alluded to the rules-based order, which, as we'll see, is also key to the Indo-Pacific concept. Then it took years to take shape. Japan only came up with his free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in 2016, but this didn't prevent the concept from expanding, and other countries, including US, Australia, India, within the EU, France, and Germany, have been using this concept, either in proper Indo-Pacific strategies or maybe in diplomatic discourse or in other foreign policy strategies. But still, this is a contested concept, as I was saying before, and basically these differ in geographic scope. For instance, we have seen that the EU's conception is stretching from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Island states. This is, for instance, different in the case of the US, which considers the Indo-Pacific as an area that stretches from the western shores of India to the western shores of the United States. Also in terms of on the tone they put on India and whether they are exclusive or inclusive, of China, and whether they are exclusive or inclusive of China, as well as in their approach, whether these strategies prioritize bilateral, unilateral, multilateral arrangements. And but they also share many similarities. For instance, in geographic terms, they all consider the Indian and the Pacific Oceans and the land around it constituted a single and continuous space. Also in the geographical understanding of the concept, there's an emerging India, and it's also very important ASEAN centrality. And even though they answer this question differently, they all are concerned about the rise of China, particularly in maritime security. And a key notion in the Indo-Pacific is how to safeguard and to maintain sea lanes of communication open. Also, as I was saying before, it's very important multilateralism and international law for keeping the Indo-Pacific as a rules-based area. So even though this may seem a bit as an abstract and distant concept without much relevance, the key question is that it's going hand in hand with other developments in the region. For instance, unilateral frameworks such as the Quad for burden sharing and collaboration on key specific issues. Here I have on the right a table which has also, well, the Quad cooperation mechanisms as well as other kind of trilateral and quadrilateral arrangements between the members. There are also other members outside of the Quad that have trilateral arrangements, such as, for instance, France and India and Australia. And also it's important the growing centrality of ASEAN mechanisms. For instance, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defense Ministers plus. Basically, ASEAN becomes a key force in organizing the region. And it's also very important to note that this comes with an increased maritime presence. As we were talking about, basically the Indo-Pacific is predominantly a maritime area, and Indo-Pacific strategies and focus on the Indo-Pacific come with an increased projection in maritime security. For instance, with freedom of navigation operations in the case of the US, and for instance, Germany that recently released its Indo-Pacific strategy, one of its key actions was also sending a frigate to the South China Sea. So basically this is also a trend. It's also important to note that this concept is generally opposed by China, which consider it as basically an exclusive strategy designed to contain China, even though its reactions, as we'll see, are different depending on the country. So basically, why does the EU decide to come up with this strategy? Basically, it's above all a political sign, a confirmation of the EU's commitment to the region and to take advantages of the opportunities, but also be more present and to contribute to mitigate the security challenges. It also comes from the perception that the EU is an actor in its own right, basically with an economic role and also as a contributor to development assistance, actually the top contributor to development assistance in the Indo-Pacific. And it's also important to its geopolitical aspirations, that is being considered as a security actor in the region is important for the EU's quest for strategic autonomy, basically. And also I have here other more specific EU interests in the region, apart from the self-evident importance. The EU and Asia trading goods was 1.5 trillion euros in 2019. Then the EU is, of course, a trading giant, depending on sea lanes of communication. And basically, some of the hotspots in the region, such as the South China Sea, account for 30% of global trade. So 30% of global trade passes through these lanes. And also the Indo-Pacific is home to 4 out of 10 EU top trading partners and 5 strategic partners. So basically it makes sense to consider this region integrated as a whole and to approach it with a single strategy. And basically, in terms of where we come from, I believe that the Indo-Pacific is the latest step in a series of ways of thinking about the region on the EU side. So basically, since the 2010s, early 2010s, we have a growing interest and depth of EU ambition in the region. That is, there's more initiatives and there's more dynamism. For instance, in 2012 alone, we have the EU accessing the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation with ASEAN. Also the same year, Europe and Asia become each other's biggest trading partners, and the EU released its guidelines on EU foreign and security policy in East Asia, which call for a more comprehensive and developed foreign policy and security role for the EU in Asia. This also increases with Mogherini, who recognizes the importance of Asia in her inaugural speech at the European Parliament, and then continue in this direction on paying more importance to the region, and also paying, for instance, a growing number of visits, being more involved in security dialogues, etc. But on top of this intensification of the EU's interest in the region, we also have that it broadens the scope of what it's interested in. And for instance, it pays more and more attention to security developments. So again, with Mogherini, this is accelerated, and we have, for instance, that she said in one of the key security dialogues that the EU is no longer a donor, but a strategic partner. And basically that security was the biggest area of growth in EU-Asia relations, and that it's a security actor in its own right. So basically there's this signaling towards partners that the EU wants to be more present. And with this, it comes also a change in approach, basically from focusing on key players in Asia. The EU tries to diversify more its relations and to have a more balanced approach towards Asia. And for instance, I have here just a few examples of the many agreements that have been concluded in recent years and that point towards this direction. And also, even though Asia and the Indo-Pacific is still not the EU's top priority, it gains importance in the EU's overall foreign policy. So for instance, we have in the 2003 European Security Strategy, there was almost no attention to the region, whereas in the 2016 Global Strategy, there are 17 references to Asia, basically, and it recognizes a security role for the EU in Asia. And just to mention a couple of documents which I think are important in this evolution towards a more engaged role of the EU in Asia and towards the Indo-Pacific, we have the EU Security Cooperation in and with Asia from 2018, which has this normative approach, also focusing on international law and a rules-based order, which, as we saw, was important for the Indo-Pacific. We have also some emphasis on connectivity, which was later developed, as we will see. And it calls for a more coordinated EU security activities in Asia, which is basically one of the steps the Indo-Pacific strategy takes further. And again, it emphasizes cooperation with ASEAN and ASEAN-led regional security architecture. So basically, there's this ASEAN centrality, which is also important to the Indo-Pacific. And then we have the EU connectivity strategy, which was partly a response to the Belt and Road Initiative, China, but it's way more than that. It's basically the EU's vision for connectivity. And this is important because connectivity, both in the EU's strategy as well as more broadly, is one of the key pillars of the Indo-Pacific is connectivity. And actually the EU began using the concept of the Indo-Pacific in this context in one of its connectivity agreements with Japan in 2018. There's also a huge emphasis on rules-based sustainability, sustainable connectivity, as well as partnerships. And this, which was initially created to address EU-Asia connectivity, is being further expanded, for instance, to include the Indo-Pacific more broadly, as well as a global connectivity strategy. And so what we have is that the EU is strengthening its strategic posture in Asia. And I think more or less the same happens with China. Basically, how China factors in previous EU policies towards Asia is that basically how the EU address China is avoiding blaming Beijing while expressing concerns for certain developments in the region. For instance, in the 2012 guidelines, the EU refers to China's growing defense expenditure and aggressive diplomacy in the South China Sea as an area of concern without actually blaming China. These strategies also tend to be inclusive. That is, they see engaging with China as the way to go while counterbalancing certain aspects which are perceived as challenging. And this is, for instance, the case of connectivity, in which China is considered a key connectivity partner, but the cooperation is addressed in terms of actually making China adhere to more to international law and to rules-based connectivity, basically. And to give a little bit more the broader context of EU-China relations in the context of the Indo-Pacific strategy, I believe that it's important to note that there's a growing sense of fatigue of what dialogue can achieve with China. And basically, there's also a growing attention to the security implications of China's rise, and this is materializing in European Parliament resolutions as well as in other documents. There's also this perception of China as an unfair economic player and that economic relations are not balanced. And this is materializing in concrete actions, basically in, for instance, coordinated messaging participation at the Belt and Road Forum or other trade defense measures. And to mention also a document that is currently guiding relations with China, even though it's under review, and that also is present perhaps in the Indo-Pacific strategy, is the strategic outlook, which characterizes relations with China as a partner, competitor, and a rival. So basically, this means in concrete terms that it puts on separate paths economic relations on human rights. But basically, this system imploded after the EU imposed sanctions on China because of Xinjiang, and China retaliated, and currently, well, it's been under review. And on the China side, on how China approaches the EU, in line with China's more assertive diplomacy, we have harsh reactions to certain EU policies. At the same time, we have some damage control of China trying to reach out to European countries in order to basically control its reputation. And at the same time, some persuasion as well, like when we see the communications coming from the China mission in Brussels to the European Union, there's also this tone of reassurance and of trying to keep business as usual and basically highlighting achievements of cooperation and trying to maintain it that way in EU-China relations. So basically, the Indo-Pacific strategy comes in this context. As its precedents, basically we have member states Indo-Pacific strategies as building blocks for the EU vision. Also, the EU had started to mention the Indo-Pacific in diplomatic discourse. I mentioned before the connectivity partnership with Japan. Also appears in the EU-US agenda for global change, in other European Parliament resolutions. And then in March, Borrell posted one article in which he was calling for an Indo-Pacific strategy. The strategy itself is a milestone because it was agreed by the 27, and it's always difficult to achieve unanimity in foreign policy decisions. And it has some detail, and it's actually 10 pages, which is already quite long for this kind of document, but it's still vague in terms of EU interest, operationalization, geographical priorities. But at the end, its aim is also not to be a very comprehensive strategy and very detailed strategy, but rather a framework in which more particularities of the EU's relation with each Indo-Pacific country are built upon. And how China factors in this strategy, well, basically rebalancing relations with China was already a driving force as behind developing the strategy itself, as stated by Borrell in his poster from March. At the same time, the EU continues with its policy of not naming and shaming and indirectly referring to China. For instance, when the EU refers to intensifying geopolitical competition in the region, there's a lot of China in there. Also, when it refers to the challenges to the universality of human rights in the region. But here I put also Myanmar because it's important not to see everything through China lenses. And this strategy addresses other concerns as well. And for instance, the democratic backsliding in Myanmar. Also, the EU promotes an inclusive approach. It excludes no partner, and basically also even refers to the comprehensive agreement on investment with China as a good agreement, even though it was later frozen. But at the same time, the EU sees itself as a principal security actor. And basically, this means taking a step back from China and prioritizing relations with like-minded countries, specifically those that already have an Indo-Pacific strategy. So we can see that it builds on previous strategies and also echo the 2019 strategic outlook in seeing China both as a partner in terms of trade, but at the same time trying to balance other aspects of China's rise. So basically, in itself, the strategy is flexible, but it's difficult to engage China under this framework of the Indo-Pacific. In terms of policy areas, it's all-encompassing. It talks about climate change, biodiversity, security, organized crime. It's very broad, so it's not very clear how this will be developed. But just to mention the two key areas of the Indo-Pacific, and also I think of this strategy in which China features prominently, these are maritime security and connectivity. So basically, maritime security, this comes in the context of the EU increasingly reacting to China's actions in the South China Sea through statements that were previously done in a way in which they indirectly referred to China. But for instance, in April, the EU released a new statement in which it specifically refers to Chinese vessels as posing a challenge to the stability of the South China Sea. It also focuses on, the Indo-Pacific strategy focuses on a free and open maritime routes in full compliance with international law. And this comes also in the context of the EU specifically addressing China as a challenge to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea in the strategic outlook. And basically with this comes also an increased commitment of the EU to the region, for instance, by expanding the geographic scope of CRIMARIO, which is a maritime awareness initiative, which was in the Indian Ocean and now will be expanded to Southeast Asia. And also a coordinated maritime presence in the region. This is still not clear how it will happen or when or exactly how it will happen, yes. But it's expected that more information will come up in September. And in the field of connectivity, again, the EU redoubles its approach and renews its approach to sustainable and rules-based connectivity, which again comes in the context of, for instance, certain critiques made to the Belt and Road, China's Belt and Road, because of its lack of adherence to international law. And also an European Parliament resolution from just a couple of months ago that specifically identified the Belt and Road Initiative as a tool for China's diplomatic assertiveness. There are other policy areas in which we can see that there are certain indirect references to China, for instance, digital governance, in which the EU commits to promote a global, open, free, stable, and secure cyberspace in which human rights are secure. And for instance, this contrasts with China's version of cyber sovereignty. Also, in terms of trade and investment, the demands that the EU has made to China are also present in the documents. For instance, an open and fair environment for trade and balancing economic relations, basically, although at the same time it mentions the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment as a milestone. And even though this is not in the document, it's important also to note that Borrell, during a speech, specifically referred to cooperation with China in climate, fisheries, and biodiversity as essential. And basically, just to finish with the China factor, I just wanted to give a few points on China's reactions. Basically, looking at Chinese media coverage of the EU Indo-Pacific strategy by looking only at the Global Times, I drew these few main points. For instance, there's this perception that the EU should play a constructive role and avoid tension, basically that the EU shouldn't play geopolitical games and that it shouldn't come meddling in the region. There's also this perception that the regional problems are to be solved by regional powers and that the EU doesn't have much to do there. At the same time, it's also reassuring in that the EU strategy is different from the US, which is seen as more hegemonic. Also, the perception that the EU, it doesn't matter what it does because it wouldn't play a role in the region because of its own weaknesses and divisions. Again, that the EU should avoid becoming an appendage to the US for its own good. There's this notion of strategic autonomy as the EU decoupling from the US. So basically, if the EU follows the Indo-Pacific strategy, is seen by China as blindly following the US, which goes against its own interest. And then that the EU should stop using India as a vehicle to stopping China, since this could alienate China. basically again signaling against the EU's involvement in the region, particularly in areas which are seen as challenging or threatening by China. It's true that still the language is not as harsh as with the US. We have here on the right box with some comments which was made by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the US Indo-Pacific Strategy, which is defined as hegemonic, as reflecting Cold War mentality, militarism, and hypes the so-called China threat. This is not the case of the EU, but at the same time, China is warning the EU not to use, for instance, freedom of navigation as an excuse to undermine sovereignty and security of China, or for instance, backlashing against the joint statement in which the EU and Japan refer to Taiwan. And just to finish with the China factor, just wanted to highlight that even though we are focusing here on the China factor, the strategy is way more than that. It's not an anti-China strategy, and it's not a strategy designed only for China. It has a wide array of interests, and cooperation with other countries are mentioned. And even Borrell himself said that Asia is big and diverse and should not be reduced to looking only at China. So this is precisely a diversification strategy. And in terms of next steps, well, as I was saying before, there's a joint communication that will come in September, and I think it will be important for them to identify how and in which areas the EU can be an added value. There's also, I think, this line which is going to continue, which is strengthening relations with security with regional partners in terms of security, which, as we see, there's a 51% of confidence of ASEAN. This is done in an ASEAN in the EU, which is one of the top 2 favored and trusted partners. And in terms of trade, there's also ongoing FTA negotiations, with, for instance, with India or Australia. And I think the EU will redouble its interest, its efforts to conclude these negotiations. Again, strengthen relations with the US, which I think that will continue particularly under the Biden administration and will be addressed towards the Indo-Pacific now that they both have a strategy. And in terms of challenges, I think it would be important to avoid a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Indian and the Pacific Oceans are integrated, and it makes sense to consider them together, but they also have different dynamics. For instance, the Pacific Ocean is more, one of its key questions is territorial disputes, whereas in the Indian Ocean, there's more non-traditional security. And I think another challenge will be to maintain coherence, coordination, and unity. Basically, this is a milestone because it was agreed. So it will be important to maintain this coherence. And finally, convincing China that this is not a strategy designed to contain China. And basically that there are opportunities to cooperate with China under this framework, which, as the EU says, is its intention, basically. So this is all on my side. I'll be happy to hear your comments or questions. So back to you, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Cristina. It's been a wonderful presentation, and I already received one question from the audience. But before doing that, I wanted to thank you again for collaborating with us. It has been and it's a pleasure to have you here today. Before giving the floor also to Francesco, give me one moment, Francesco Di Paola. Cristina, I wanted to ask you a question, because before you were mentioning how dynamics within EU-China relations are contextualized in a growing sense of fatigue. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think an increasing role of the EU in the Indo-Pacific can affect bilateral relations with China, and how it can affect those relations? Thank you.
Well, certainly that would be a challenge, precisely because, as we had seen, China doesn't have a very optimistic view of the Indo-Pacific. It prefers Asia-Pacific, which it considers to be more focusing on economic cooperation, rather than the Indo-Pacific, which it sees more as alliances and military confrontation, geopolitical questions. So it remains to be seen how it will particularly affect relations. So far, I don't think there has been a very harsh relations on the Chinese side. At the same time, it has also not been welcome. And particularly, we're seeing, for instance, that it backlash against a joint statement between the EU and Japan It also backlashed against more cooperation with India, particularly as they revived the free trade agreement talks. So basically, I think this will not be well received by China, but at the same time, I think it's also important for the EU to diversify its relations with countries in the region and to look beyond China in some aspects in which there can be cooperation as well, while also keeping, of course, a door open for cooperation and dialogue with China. And I think what Warrell was saying is important in terms of biodiversity or climate change or other kind of questions in which, of course, China needs to be at the table and the EU needs to cooperate with China.
Fantastic, Cristina. Thank you so much. Just a small reminder, if you want to ask a question to Cristina, you have to please write to me in the chat and let me know if you want me to ask the question for you or if you want to prefer to do it yourself. So at this point, okay, we have a queue, Cristina, with questions, but the first one will be Francesco Di Paola, if you want.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I also turn on the camera just in case. So I have a question for Ms. Esperanza. You mentioned the EU as a security actor. I mean, the idea to be seen in the region as a security actor among the regional players, so like Japan, the ASEAN countries, India as well, and probably also the United States. But my question is, how credible is these goals today, considering that we are experiencing as a moment, an historic moment where the European foreign policy, I mean, the European bloc foreign policy looks extremely weak. I mean, we just come from recent months where we have seen a very not good visit of Secretary Borrell to Moscow, a very critical and difficult moment in the visit of Mrs. von der Leyen and Mr. Charles Michel to Ankara. We also had, I mean, in Spain, you had a crisis, I mean, a tension with Morocco on the borders, and now a crisis with in the skies of Belarus. So very close crisis, crisis close to the European borders. How do you think this is possible to be perceived as a trustworthy security partner in the Indo-Pacific, which is very far away from the regional and from the traditional regional area of influence of Europe as a bloc, and consider also that there is already some doubts perceived by the actors in the region, like for example Japan. I mean, Japan and China don't have exactly the same perception about the China challenge. In fact, there are some scholars speaking about the so-called China gap, so the fact that China, Japan, and other regional actors in the Indo-Pacific share a different view about China. The Europe, of course, is less worried about China's assertivity, which country like Japan, Philippines, Vietnam have a different perception on that. So the country like Japan, Philippines, and Vietnam may not perceive the US as a trustworthy partner. Also for the ASEAN countries, we can see the same. And for example, let's talk about just another issue, that is the fact that in Europe, in the East Asia Forum, Europe is not perceived as enough trustworthy to have a permanent seat, if I remember well. And yeah, and also about that, many scholars, in particular American scholars, are considering the involvement of European countries like Germany, France, Netherlands as a mere tokenism, because I personally asked the same question to well-established American scholars. They said that they don't consider the European effort in the region really particularly interesting or mentioned to develop a significant change in the balance of power of the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I agree with you. Of course, that's the challenge, right? And it's precisely why I think this strategy was developed. Of course, the credibility challenge is the main one for the Indo-Pacific, the EU's role in the Indo-Pacific. And precisely that's what I was saying, that this strategy is merely like a sign. I mean, it's more than that, but it tries to signal the EU's commitment to the region, which I think is a first step in order to be considered as a partner, basically. And I think that's why also, well, also because there are limitations of what the EU can do in the region, but I think it's important that the EU focuses on a normative approach to security in the Indo-Pacific. This is important because it focuses on what the EU can do, on where are its main strengths in terms of a normative power. That is, it can contribute to creating these regional frameworks for cooperation, at reinforcing international law with partners. That is, the EU wouldn't play a military role as the US does, but this can be an added value in a certain way. And I think what makes the EU somehow more attractive as a partner is its reliability. Currently, the problem is that many countries are seeing themselves as having to choose between the US and China, and there's also India, but they don't, basically, for instance, in ASEAN, they prefer the EU after Japan. Between Japan, India, the US, China, and the European Union, there's a 50% support for the European Union as a reliable partner. So basically, I think this more neutral role, a third way in the European Union could play in its favor. And I think another key question is that what is going on in the Indo-Pacific has global links. That is, for instance, when rules and standards are being challenged or are having, and there are other kind of tensions, this can also impact other regions and also international institutions. So I think it's also important to note that cooperation in the Indo-Pacific is not only restricted to the region, but also to, for instance, in the case of India, they mention cooperation within the World Trade Organization or the G20. So there's also the weight of the EU as a diplomatic actor, which can be an asset. And finally, in terms of what you were saying of different perceptions of China, I think that's completely, accurate. Not all have the same perceptions, but that doesn't mean that there are no areas for cooperation. Basically, they can see, for instance, the US, I believe, that sees China's rise in more strategic terms. That is, it sees a containment strategy as the solution to address China's rise. However, in the case, in the EU's case, I think it sees China's challenge more in terms of China's behavior as being threatening and China's defiance of international law, for instance. But this doesn't mean that they cannot cooperate, for instance, in keeping multilateralism alive, basically, because even though their conceptions are different, maybe some part of the answer is the same. Or also, for instance, in keeping connectivity sustainable and rules-based. Again, they don't exactly agree on how to consider China, but they can cooperate on these questions. So I think this, I hope, answer your question. I'm happy to reply to anything else.
There was just the last one about how do you see the involvement of Germany, Netherlands, and France, which many American scholars consider just mere tokenism. Thank you.
Well, again, I think it's more of the same, as in, I don't think the US is going to consider this as a milestone for security in the region in terms of the European navies having a key role in the Indo-Pacific. And again, there's this challenge of European navies being reduced over the past few years, which is a key question in terms of what and how can they contribute, as well as you were mentioning other crises that are closer to home, and that I think that have a more priority in terms of the challenges that are being addressed at the EU level and the member state level. But this is a signal to Indo-Pacific partners that they are committed to play a role in the region, that they share some of the concerns, not all, it's not going to be basically from 0 to 100, but it's a progression. And basically, I think that even though it's not going to be like a huge deployment of naval forces, I think it has an impact on the EU's reliability as a partner in the region, as well as, well, as an added value in keeping, for instance, sea lanes of communication open.
Okay, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So first, thank you, Cristina, for the presentation, and I just wanted to ask a question regarding mutual perception. That is something that I've been focusing on for the last year, and it's more regarding, we could say, more of like a theoretical or like political theory perspective in this way. And I just wanted to ask more, it's kind of like a broad question, so you can answer as you want. How would you think this strategy, this kind of like regional approach strategy, the fact that the European Union is understanding also, or kind of presenting the rest of the world, or trying to make Indo-Pacific countries think that they're also a region, that they can work as a whole, right? How this mutual perception from one region or like a supranational body approach to another, in a way, supranational body can work or can make political relations in terms of the political world, like real life between presidents or diplomatic relations, and also at a scholar level, how this maybe this less aggressive approach, the fact that it's not bilateral, one country versus another country, like a group of countries and another group of countries, how this approach can positively or negatively, but I'm more interested in the positive side. What are the positive consequences? How, like, could this approach in terms of strategies could bring both regions together in terms of ideology and mutual perception between the nation states that compose, or that kind of like those different regions are built upon?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try my best to answer.
Yeah.
I think that positive side. Okay, I think that one positive aspect for interregional relations could be that now what is going on in the Indo-Pacific and in Asia is closer to Europe. That is, in considering the Indo-Pacific as an integrated whole, we have the boundary of what's going on there closer to, for instance, Africa, which is actually a key priority for the EU. So I think in this sense, there's a growing sense of interconnectedness, which is also goes hand in hand with everything going related to connectivity. Also, I think another key aspect is that initiatives that were previously developed for the Indian Ocean and more related in Africa, which is where the EU again is putting all its efforts, that can be expanded to other areas, for instance, to the Southeast Asia, and is what is going on with Primario, as we were seeing. It started in the Indian Ocean. Now that it's considered the region as a whole, it's spreading to the Pacific as well. And also, I think is good in the sense that countries with Indo-Pacific visions, that is, that they share an understanding of what's going on in the region, at least as like a minimum understanding, and that they agree on some part of the solution as well. I think this is good in terms of fostering cooperation. For instance, I was mentioning unilateral frameworks, and I mentioned the Quad, but there are other trilateral ones in which countries can cooperate more easily. Perhaps sometimes multilateral frameworks are good for some stuff, but for others is perhaps more efficient to cooperate in small groupings. So this could be another added value that is going hand in hand with the Indo-Pacific. And in terms of the impact the EU's strategy will have, I think it's more a progression. It's basically not only what the EU is doing, but the fact that only this year or in the past few months, including 2020, Germany and the Netherlands and the EU came up with strategy. Also, the UK started referring to the concept. There's some debate in Canada, which allegedly has an Indo-Pacific strategy, but has not been released. So basically, I think not only the EU, which has its weight as a diplomatic actor, but the fact that many countries are approaching the region in the same way, then I think it will have an impact in the self-perception as well. And in the negative side, I think it's important the fact that it doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is, in seeing what is going on in the Pacific, which is, for instance, with China's rise, and yes, and territorial disputes as part of an integrated whole, we can't forget that in the Indian Ocean, perhaps problems are different, that there's more non-traditional security questions. So actually, well, I fear that some negative consequences will be like seeing everything as part of the same basket, whereas there are differences actually. And I think it should be approached differently. And China doesn't approach with the same kind of aggressiveness or assertiveness its territorial disputes in the Pacific Ocean as compared to the Indian one.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Cristina, we have another question, in this case from Álvaro Gómez del Valle, who asks you if you could elaborate a little bit on where does Taiwan fit within the EU Indo-Pacific strategy?
Thank you. Well, Taiwan is not mentioned in the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, but I think, well, it's obviously important. And I think actually there are some signs of more commitment from the EU to Taiwan coming recently. And for instance, we can see it included in joint declarations with Japan, in joint declarations with the US as well. And there was a draft resolution by the European Parliament in which basically encouraged the EU to support China's integration in international organizations, which denounced China's aggressiveness against Taiwan. So I think there's at least some more political commitment to basically, to further collaboration with Taiwan. I think there's also the perception of Taiwan as a like-minded partner as well, which shares many of the EU's values and some of the EU's interests as well. And also on the Taiwanese side, I think there's an interest in fostering relations with the European Union as well. And well, there were supposed to be some bilateral investment agreement talks that they were supposed to commence once the comprehensive agreement on investment with China was concluded, which are now a bit in standby. But I think that there are efforts on both sides and there is interest, and it will be, of course, a very key player in the Indo-Pacific and on the EU's strategic thinking on the Indo-Pacific.
Fantastic, Cristina. The next one is Barbara.
Hello. Hi, thank you for your very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask about how the EU-ASEAN upgraded their relationship to a strategic partnership last December. This decision, at least from the EU side, was most likely heavily influenced by the increased importance of the Indo-Pacific. However, the concept of a strategic partnership has long been criticized by EU academics due to its lack of a precise meaning and kind of use as an umbrella term. So I would like to ask, what do you think are the implications of this strategic partnership in general of in the EU's role as a global actor, but also in the Indo-Pacific specifically? Thank you.
Yeah, basically, of course, strategic partnerships are vague in themselves, and I would say particularly more with ASEAN. There is still not very clear what it will mean, a strategic partnership with ASEAN, and they haven't developed actually a roadmap. It's understood that maybe so what was agreed before is what's going to govern bilateral relations. But I think this is particularly important because it's an upgrade after 44 years of partnerships already. And actually, when Borrell made a visit to the region last week or a couple of weeks ago, he decided to upgrade the delegation to ASEAN. So I think this, in terms of implication, this could be a consolidation of collaborative arrangements. It's also some kind of political sign in terms of shared objectives and basically of more high-level collaboration. I think some of the key issues for the EU will be gaining access to the East Asia Summit, which is something it's been asking for a long time and hasn't been agreed yet. And I also think it sees ASEAN as key for multilateralism in the region, as a key organizing force. Also, I think it also comes again in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Agreement, Economic Partnership. ASEAN played a key role, and also now its economic centrality is reinforced. So I think this also comes hand in hand with more economic relations, or at least an effort of rapprochement in that sense. And in terms of how it will continue, I think that there's development cooperation is going to continue to be the main pillar. That also a security role will take more shape, but neither ASEAN nor the EU are security actors as such in a traditional way. And also more transboundary issues, particularly now with the COVID-19 crisis, such as health. So basically, I think it will evolve in this direction. And as of strategic partnerships in general, I think even though they are a bit vague, I think it will be the main tool for the EU to pursue its Indo-Pacific strategy. I think basically it's understanding this strategy in bilateral terms with relations, for instance, with Korea, India, Japan, Taiwan, ASEAN. I think, yeah, this will be the way forward, particularly increasing cooperation with like-minded partners.
Fantastic, thank you, Cristina. The last question, the last question is from Sophia. She is asking, how will this strategy develop or age in the case of stronger military cooperation within EU member states in the Pacific, or maybe even in the case of institutionalized EU military action? What would be your thoughts on this, Cristina?
Well, this is a lot of forward thinking because the strategy is not finished itself and there's still not a clear military cooperation among member states. But my first thought on this will be that, well, it will change in terms of operationally, as in, I mean, basically, I think it will be way easier for the EU to have a coordinated maritime security presence there. I think it will be easier for the EU to collaborate with Asian navies, which is one of the key aspects of this strategy as well. It will be easy also to cooperate, or easier at least, to cooperate with other partners in other parts of the world. So I think it will make things easier, but it wouldn't necessarily change or suppose a fundamental increase or change of the EU's commitment to the region. This will be my first thought. Of course, we'll have to see how the Indo-Pacific strategy evolves, how military cooperation plan evolve, and things can change a lot as we have seen over the past year. But in principle, I think especially it will have an impact in how operations are developed.
Marvelous, Cristina. This is a reminder for our audience. Before ending this webinar, our webinars team will create a poll. It will take you only 1-2 minutes with a few questions about your opinion on certain issues concerning the EU strategy in the Indo-Pacific. So if Chiara or Valeria can make sure that we are able to create this poll so that the audience can, fantastic, nice. The results of this poll are going to be shared and sent to our members in our newsletter. So that's why we care about the opinion of our audience in the webinars that we organize from time to time. Okay. In the meantime, I wanted to thank you, Cristina, because we have been able to cover some of the key issues concerning the Indo-Pacific and the role of the European Union in the region. And so from European Guanxi's side, it would be a privilege to continue this discussion in the long term with you, Cristina. Yeah.
Thank you very much to you for inviting me here and to all of you for spending also this afternoon with me here.
Fantastic. We'll just now wait for the results of the poll. If maybe the people, if maybe the audience have finished. Yeah, fantastic. That's it. This is the last step of our webinar. So thank you again, Cristina, for today. And thank you also for the audience to joining us on this wonderful sunny Saturday. So see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.